Welcome back to the Bar Exam Toolbox podcast. Today we're talking about different types of memorization techniques for different kinds of learners as part of our Quick Tips series. Your Bar Exam Toolbox hosts are Allison Monahan and Lee Burgess. That's me. We're here to demystify the bar exam experience so you can study effectively, stay sane, and hopefully pass and move on with your life. We're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the career-related website Career Dicta. Allison also runs the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review on your favorite listening app and check out our sister podcast, the Law School Toolbox podcast. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can reach us via the contact form on barexamtoolbox.com, and we'd love to hear from you. And with that, let's get started. This is Lee from the Law School Toolbox and the Bar Exam Toolbox. Welcome back. Today, we're talking about memorization for the bar exam. In particular, we will discuss several memorization techniques and provide examples to illustrate each technique. We will also talk about different learning styles and discuss how different types of learners may want to adjust certain techniques to best fit their learning style. Lastly, we will go over some general memorization tips that all bar exam students should follow. Before we jump into specific memorization techniques, let's review the three main types of learners: auditory learners, visual learners, and kinesthetic learners. Auditory learners learn best by hearing information repeated or speaking it out loud. Visual learners learn best by seeing information or picturing it in their mind. And kinesthetic learners learn best by doing something with the information, like organizing it or explaining it to a friend. Remember, not everyone will neatly fit into one of these learning types. In fact, students sometimes find that they have one dominant learning style as well as a secondary learning style. If that is the case, you should implement memorization techniques aimed at both learning styles to maximize the effectiveness of your work. Now that we've talked about the different learning styles, let's get into some memorization techniques, many of which are commonly referred to as mnemonics. By mnemonics, we mean a learning technique that helps with retention of information. As you will see, even though some of these techniques may be partially suited for a certain learning style, different kinds of learners can adapt the techniques to take advantage of their benefits. We will talk about how to do this as we discuss each technique. The first popular mnemonic that we should talk about is what we will call the first letter mnemonic. This technique requires you to create a new word or group of words using the first letter of each word that you must remember. First letter mnemonics may be particularly helpful to memorize a list of items, such as the kinds of contracts that are subject to the statute of frauds, or the permissible evidentiary uses for prior crimes or bad acts. With regard to the statute of frauds, some students use the first letter mnemonic my legs to help them remember the list of contracts that require a writing. The M stands for contracts in consideration of marriage. The Y stands for contracts that cannot be performed within 1 year. The L stands for contracts for the sale of land. The E stands for a contract to be an executor. The G stands for contracts for the sale of goods over $500. And the S stands for contracts for suretyship. For the permissible evidentiary uses for prior crimes or bad acts, students sometimes use the word mimic. In mimic, the first M stands for motive, the I stands for intent, the second M stands for mistake, the second I stands for identity, and the C stands for common scheme or plan. First letter mnemonics can also be helpful when trying to memorize a rule that has many required elements, such as the requirements for adverse possession. Actual, open and notorious, exclusive, and continuous for the statutory period. In other words, HELUVA, which stands for hostile, exclusive, lasting for the statutory period, uninterrupted, or continuous, visible, meaning open and notorious, and actual possession. If popular first letter mnemonics don't trigger the right words in your mind, you can create your own phrase, such as no cheap, for the elements of adverse possession. Sometimes the act of creating a first letter mnemonic, especially an odd word or phrase, will help you remember the mnemonic better. In particular, kinesthetic learners may benefit from creating their own first letter mnemonics. On the other hand, auditory learners may find first letter mnemonics that use alliteration, such as mimic, especially helpful. Auditory learners may also want to use first-letter mnemonics that incorporate rhythm or rhyme. Visual learners may benefit from writing out first-letter mnemonics in a vertical or horizontal diagram. So regardless of your learning style, make sure to consider using first-letter mnemonics to memorize lists or a series of elements for the bar exam. Now, what if pictures and images stick in your brain better than letters or phrases? In that case, you may benefit from our next mnemonic device, the memory palace technique. This technique takes advantage of the brain's visual and spatial learning abilities. The memory palace technique involves bringing to mind a place with which you are familiar, such as your bedroom, and visualizing yourself taking a walk through a familiar place. As you walk through the location, try associating things that you must remember with objects in the space. For example, if you are trying to remember the requirements for a valid contract as you walk through your bedroom, you would associate items in the room with offer, acceptance, consideration, and no defenses to formation. Maybe a glove in your bedroom closet reminds you of an outstretched hand representing offer, and your college diploma on your wall reminds you of your acceptance to college. The piggy bank on your dresser may remind you of consideration, and the layout of the furniture in your bedroom reminds you of the word formation, triggering you to think about defenses to formation of the contract. You can also mentally place items in your memory palace location if you are having trouble associating items you remember. If you want to visually add items to the location, try an oddly placed item. Something unique and out of place is more likely to be memorable than an ordinary item. Of course, visual learners may find the memory palace technique particularly appealing, but all learners can benefit from this technique. Kinesthetic learners may find it helpful to map out a memory palace on paper as they create it. Auditory learners may want to describe their memory palace and the items that they use to remember keywords or rules. Another mnemonic that may benefit all learners is something referred to as chunking. Chunking involves grouping individual pieces of information into larger groups that are easier to remember. For example, you could use chunking to memorize a grocery list by grouping the items in the list by category: fruits, vegetables, meats, etc. But there are also ways to use chunking to memorize rules for the bar exam. For example, you could group Federal Rule of Civil Procedure deadlines by length. In other words, you could create a list of all 30-day deadlines, a list of 21-day deadlines, and a list of miscellaneous deadlines. Memorizing a list of like deadlines or required time periods may be much easier than memorizing each individual deadline in a vacuum. As with all of these memorization techniques, you can adjust your use of chunking based on your learning style. If you are an auditory learner, you may want to repeat your lists or groupings out loud. If you are a visual learner, you could make written lists or charts to help you internalize which rules fall on which list. If you are a kinesthetic learner, you will likely benefit from the exercise of grouping like items and even explaining to a friend why you created the groups that you did. Now this brings us to our next memorization technique. What if you know that you learn well when you explain things out loud, but you are studying alone, as many are while studying for the bar exam? In this case, you should try a technique that is sometimes called the rubber duck method. This technique involves explaining a rule or concept out loud to your dog or your favorite plant or any other animate or inanimate object, even a rubber duck. In other words, don't wait for another person who is willing to listen to you explain the rule against perpetuities to reap the retention benefits of explaining a concept out loud. The rubber duck method may be particularly crucial to your understanding and memorization of bar exam concepts if you are a kinesthetic learner. Auditory learners also usually benefit from hearing themselves explain a concept or rule. If you are a visual learner, try using visuals to teach your rubber duck. For example, if you are a visual learner, you may want to teach your rubber duck a concept by diagramming that concept or writing out the rules in a chart. Now that we have talked about several memorization techniques, let's talk about some general memorization strategies that all students should remember when studying for the bar exam. Let's start with this motto: eat, sleep, practice, repeat. Of course, you may not eat, sleep, and practice in that order, but the eat, sleep, practice, repeat motto is a good reminder of several ways to set yourself up for memorization success during bar prep. First, eat and sleep. In other words, take care of your physical body by eating nutritious food and getting enough rest. A healthy diet and adequate sleep improve your memory. So does exercise. During bar prep, it may be easy to ignore your body's physical needs. Who has time to meal prep, sleep for 7 to 9 hours a night, and cram in a daily walk or run when you have so much studying to do, right? Wrong. Your brain is part of your physical body, and it will function better when you take care of it. Eating healthy food, sleeping enough, and exercising will also reduce the stress and anxiety that are likely to creep up during bar prep. Reducing stress and anxiety also helps your memory. After all, worrying uses mental energy that you could otherwise use to memorize information. So don't ignore the importance of the eat, sleep, and exercise, part of our memorization motto. Next, practice. There are a lot of different ways to practice regurgitating rules for the bar exam. Many students find flashcards to be a beneficial tool. And most importantly, practice MEE and MBE questions are key to successful bar memorization. As you may have heard on this podcast before, when it comes to bar practice questions, start early and practice often. This will ensure that you have enough time to follow the final word in our motto, repeat. Repetition is crucial to memorization, but rather than trying to drill a mass amount of information repeatedly in the 2 weeks before the bar, we recommend that you start bar memorization early enough to take advantage of spaced repetition. Spaced repetition is a well-documented learning technique that incorporates strategically timed review to maximize retention. In general, when you are trying to memorize new information, you need to review it frequently, such as daily or even every couple of hours. Then as the information becomes stored in your brain, you can retain it by reviewing it at less frequent intervals. Spaced repetition is basically the opposite of cramming, and it promises far better results. So how can you use spaced repetition during your bar prep process? Well, we recommend that you start drilling rule retention at least 3 months before the exam. Start with one subject or set of rules at a time. Quiz yourself on your first set of rules once every morning and once every evening for several days. As you master a rule, move that rule to your less frequent review needed category. Flashcards are a great tool to use for spaced repetition review, because you can easily move cards into separate stacks based on how well you know the rules on the cards. As you move cards into a pile for less frequent review, add new cards to replace them. Repeat the newest cards the most often, 2 times a day. Cards that you know somewhat well, 1 time a day, or once every other day, and cards that you know very well every 3 or 4 days. Continue reviewing cards less frequently as you become more familiar with them until you work your way through all the flashcards or rules. If manually sorting flashcards seems too complicated, there are some online study tools that you can use instead. Serious, SRS, is a good example of a spaced repetition-based online study tool, which can be found at spacedrepetition.com. This tool uses electronic flashcards to test your understanding and gives you curated sets of flashcards daily based on how well you know the rules on each card. The platform includes several sets of legal electronic flashcards, including a set of frequently tested MBE rules. We have some other podcast episodes on this topic, including an interview with the founder. We will link to those in the show notes, and we encourage you to check them out. Well, that wraps up our overview of memorization tips for the bar exam. If you have any questions about memorization or are still struggling to retain information after trying all of these tips, feel free to reach out to us via the Bar Exam Toolbox website. We love helping students come up with new ways to memorize all of the information that you must know to pass the bar exam. If you enjoyed this episode of the Bar Exam Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on your favorite listening app. We'd really appreciate it, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you're still in law school, you might also like to check out our popular Law School Toolbox podcast as well. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Allison at lee@barexamtoolbox.com or allison@barexamtoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via the website contact form at barexamtoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.